Good morning, everyone. Oh, good, you're with me here. Thank you so much. It's such a delight to be here. I can't even recall when I was last in Nashville, but it's wonderful. And you're so kind to come out for what is such an important subject. I would like to begin with a couple of quotes. Our time is short. I have a lot I want to say, so let me begin right away. The first one comes from Leonard Swindler, intellectual leader, pastor, teacher, all the rest. He said as follows: 10 years, I would tell you, before 9/11, the following prophetic words. He wrote, "The future offers two alternatives, death or dialogue. Until the edge of the present era, humans lived in the age of monologue. That age is now passing. We are now poised at the entrance of the age of dialogue. Today, nuclear or ecological or other, catastrophic devastation lies just a little bit further down the path of monologue. It is only by struggling out of the self-centered monologic mindset into dialogue with the other as they really are, and not as we have projected them in our monologues, that we can avoid such cataclysmic disasters." In other words, what he is arguing for is depth dialogue. And it is implicit in this reference, this telling phrase, the others as they really are. Dialogue is so much greater, you see, than simply trading information about the peculiarities of any religious community or the like. It's much more, you know this. A second quote, it comes from Agatha Christie. It's dated around 1920, Dead Man's Folly. It goes like the following. "Ah, Poirot looked at the snapshot. Yes, it is as you say, quite obvious when you have been told what it is. So much depends on how you look at a thing," laughed Warburton. "That is a very profound truth." In other words, it so depends on how you look at something. I would suggest to you, in speaking for the evangelicals this morning, I want to speak to them and I want to speak to you, but I want you to know that I'm giving an evangelical interpretation here so that the others who aren't here, who catch this by internet or otherwise after the fact, can listen and hear this and see from someone who has spent 40 years in the evangelical world why this is so important. Last week, a Sikh resident from the Chicago suburbs was brutally assaulted by a random stranger. The perpetrator told the man, "Terrorists, go back to your home, bin Laden," before the victim fell unconscious. And this innocent individual, a father of two, was identified with terrorists, and bigotry was used to justify a horrific beating. Second illustration. We've heard it play out. We know the characters. I hardly need to mention their names, though I will. Donald Trump. I won't answer that question. Is Obama a Muslim or is he a Christian? I won't answer that question, he says. I've moved beyond that. And as for the question given to him, well, do we need to get rid of Muslims who are in training camps here in this country presenting a threat to us? He said, well, let's move on. Let's not answer that one. You're well aware. If you are, raise your hand. Well, I have a few hands. You've been watching the news. Third illustration. Ben Carson asked, "Would you have a Muslim as president?" No. It's not in our American way. All three are illustrations of what is occurring in our country this day that makes the reason for us to be here very important. And so in speaking to the evangelicals, by the way, I should say, many, many years I worked for the NAE, 28 to be precise, until they decided I needed to go. For those of you who know that story, I gave a little too much fresh air to Terry Gross on Fresh Air. I suggested that, you see, there were these wide issues of whether or not we should care for our brother. Economic justice, even those who were LGBT by coming out for civil unions, but mostly for climate justice. These were the issues which she was asking about. She also, by the way, asked who I voted for, and I had the audacity to say who I did, and of course, it was about a week later I was asked to leave the association. I had been there 28 years. I didn't know I had to be so careful with my words. We do. You may have discovered this yourself. But I have a Bible study of sorts, if you'll forgive me. Evangelicals, we do this, and there will be evangelicals who would say, if you don't do this, then where are you coming from? So let me say where I'm coming from. I'm saying Luke 10:29, very quickly. This passage is so familiar, it's almost even dangerous. We all know the moral of Jesus' famous story, the Good Samaritan. Love your enemies. After all, that's what happens here. A man is traveling down a dangerous road when he's attacked by bandits, robbed, left for dead, and two men who come by who should have cared, don't. And then comes one who shouldn't care, but does, the Samaritan. Clean and simple, right. Well, maybe then again, maybe there's something more here that's going on. In other words, I don't have anything wrong with the classic moral of the story. God expects us to care for our neighbor, but to see our neighbor as anyone who is in need. That's the classic story. And in many ways, that's the issue at hand, you see, between the priest and the Levite. They see this man as a burden that delays them from accomplishing what they wanted to accomplish. The Samaritan, however, wherever he may go, or whatever he may be doing, he sees the man as a person in need, a child of God, as someone who inherently deserves his time and attention. And so I would suggest to you that's the traditional, and that's understandable, and that's acceptable, and that's right. God calls us to do more. He created all of us in the image of God. Christian, Jew, Muslim, Sikh, everyone. Now, you should know that's not in debate in evangelical circles, really, that we are all made in the image of God. What is really in debate is how should we treat one another? And it's to this question that then we get to, because you see, the lawyer asks this question, who is my neighbor? That is, who counts? Who am I responsible for? Falls into the purview of God's command to care for neighbor. We shouldn't be surprised by that question. Lawyers do that, by the way, don't they? Give a laugh for a lawyer. They parse, they qualify, they define elements of the law with great precision and care. And I suspect that rather than assume the lawyer is simply out to get Jesus, he's trying to justify himself. And as we've already seen, Jesus responds by telling a story that redefines his neighbor, not in terms of race or religion. Oh, yes, not in terms of race or religion or any of the, yes, or proximity, but in terms of vulnerability, whatever is in need. But then he goes on to do something very interesting. He doesn't ask who was the Samaritan's neighbor, he asks who acted like a neighbor. The answer, of course, is obvious to the lawyer and us. It's the Samaritan who went out of his way. Okay, what's the point I'm making here? It's that suddenly the neighbor isn't simply the one in need, but rather the one who provides for our need, the one who takes care of us. And so as I look at our theme, our Muslim neighbor, I'm thinking about this from both perspectives. And the second one is maybe even more compelling than the first. That is the classic definition of who is my neighbor. The second one raises an uncomfortable question. Who has been our neighbor by caring for us of late? I would ask you. Because it's uncomfortable because, why, we're Americans, don't you know? We spend most of our time, energy, and our money trying to be invulnerable. Yeah, I hear an amen. Try precisely, thank you, to need as little as possible from those around us. Perhaps a fear of being a burden or of owing others. Or that we are just afraid to be vulnerable because we show our need that may not be met. Whatever the reason, so many of us are mortified by the idea, myself included, by showing our deepest need to others and having a hard time receiving a compliment, let alone serious aid. But truth be told, it's this other part, being willing to receive aid and help, especially to and from those we don't normally see as like us. So perhaps the call isn't only to invite us to imagine those who we should be helping, but those who might help us if we give them a chance. That by way of a spiritual introduction. We are bound together by our shared need, by the awareness of our common vulnerability, by a sense that God has worked through some people to care for us and still wants to meet our needs through others. And so I'd ask you, whether Christian, Muslim, Sikh, or otherwise here today, Jewish or Buddhist or whatever, who has met your need? And we are invited to look around us to care for those similarly in need. Might we see ourselves, you see, as really the person, the traveler left for dead in the ditch by the road? Can we then rise up to meet others in need? By God's grace we do, and I believe we can. So that, here ends the reading of the Word. Thank you very much. A story. I looked it up. I was intrigued. I had actually read the story of the Sikh who was bludgeoned on the street in a Chicago suburb to look up the word bigot. Do you know where it comes from? If you know, raise your hand. If you don't, I would like to apprise you. I found it. It goes like this. The origins of the word bigot dates as far back as 1598, and according to Wikipedia, the story goes that when the Normans' Duke Rollo was marrying King Charles's daughter, he refused to kiss the king's foot in token of subjection, unless the king would hold it out for that specific reason. And when the king urged him to do it, when being urged to do it, Rollo answered hastily, "No, by God," whereupon the king called him bigot, which then passed from him to his people. So the Normans were the first victims. Did you get that? Bigot, no, by God. That's where it's at in the language. Thus began the use of the term, sometimes justifiably, other times not. But you see, it suggests not just the rejection of someone for their race or religion, but can be used to refer to intolerance to whole groups of people in general based on their characteristics, such as religion. And attacks against Muslim, Arab, South Asian Americans occur frequently in our society. Sometimes as hate crimes, sometimes not. But they are rooted in bigotry. And so the question then, since I'm speaking to my evangelicals, do you see it? And I would suggest you do. Many do not. And thus I would suggest to them a conversion. But the need of a conversion. If you've never changed your mind, this is my own personal aphorism, comes from changes in my own life, which I'll enumerate quickly. If you've never changed your mind about something, pinch yourself. You may be dead. You may be intellectually dead. You may be physically almost dead. But if you've never changed your mind about something, I tell evangelicals, you may be intellectually, culturally, socially, or politically dead. Change your mind. So I had risen after many years, 28 years to be precise, to be the top staff person of the National Association of Evangelicals. Now we had presidents. They changed every 2 or 3 years. So over the course of the years, that meant I had at least 12 presidents I had served faithfully. And I admire and love them all. But I, of course, overspoke myself in some sorts with Terry Gross, and I was forced to leave. And what's necessary for you to know as way of a background of sorts, because that was 2008. In 2001, 9/11 occurred, and in 2002, within short order, the evangelicals in America were saying, well, you know, I don't even need to tell you whom. Islam is an evil and wicked religion. Comes right out of this part of the country, does it not? I won't mention any names. But when that same individual attempted to hold a prayer rally on the steps of the Pentagon, when Franklin Graham attempted to hold a prayer rally on the steps of the Pentagon at the start of a war in Iraq in 2003, I spoke up and said, I just don't think that's a very good idea. It wasn't really a bad comment. I just was offering an opinion. And you would be interested to know that evangelical mission leaders meeting in Seoul at the time, who had heard it, over 100, said, "Thank you, Jesus." Somebody finally said the truth. But what is necessary, even to this day, you see, all those years later, while there has been some mitigation of this language, evil and wicked religion and the rest, our evangelicals, my family, needs to be called out in a certain sense. And the statistics are relevant. Let me give you just a couple. It's this visioning thing. How you see things. How do you see yourself? We as evangelicals see ourselves as loving people who hate no one. But when the data is collected and we're asked to answer these kinds of questions, I serve on the board of the Public Religion Research Institute, otherwise known as PRI, we find that more than 8 in 10 Americans say that self-proclaimed Christians who commit acts of violence in the name of Christianity are not really Christians. So if the Christians do this, they're not really Christians. While only 48% of Americans said that self-proclaimed Muslims who commit violence in the name of Muslims are not really Muslim. You follow this statistic, what I'm saying to you? A huge blind spot, as Robbie Jones at PRI says. He says he thinks it's possible that the younger generation of evangelicals and younger Americans might facilitate a resolution of the public's current ambivalence about the place of American Muslims in society. But there is still this huge problem. And it's how we see one another. And it's also found in the Pew Research data on warm feelings versus others. Have you ever seen that data? Well, let me just give you one statistic here. It goes like this. In a poll conducted in 2014, Pew Research Center found that when respondents were asked to rate religious groups on a feelings thermometer from 0, you can imagine that's coldest, most negative, to 100, it's the warmest, white evangelicals gave their coldest response to, would you want to guess? Muslims? No, actually to atheists. And then, of course, Muslims. And their highest warm feelings to their fellow evangelicals, 82%, followed by Jews, 69%, and Catholics, 62%. Now, you could say this might simply be a factor related to, how often we have relationships with people of another faith. And indeed, it may well be, because the data show that very few people actually cross over these lines. They do. Very few people cross over. Looking for the figures. 3 in 10 Americans say that they interact daily, 6%, or occasionally, 24%, with a Muslim. More than 2/3, 68%, report that they seldom or never interact with a Muslim. 68% seldom or never. And more disturbing is this. 6 in 10 evangelical Protestants believe that the values of Islam are at odds with American values. 6 in 10. It's even higher for Tea Partiers. And you have to ask yourself, if you pay attention to public events, I did, I was traveling here, I was invited to some of these events, including the Papal Mass. Incredibly beautiful. I enjoyed every minute of it, as an evangelical Protestant. But I turned on the television to come here, and I discovered that the Speaker of the House had resigned. In fact, when I watched Pope Francis deliver his address before Congress, boy, is he a politician. He really knows how to couch his words carefully, to know what to say and not to say. Mind you, he never uttered the words climate change. That's all right. The encyclical addresses it, and you refer to it often. But you see, Mr. Boehner was sitting behind him, and if you watch very clearly, he looked very glum, and we knew maybe what was going on now in retrospect. He was leaving. He was resigning because he can't control his conservatives. And this has implications for this relationship. Why? Because we not only have to have a vision, this broad vision of who is our neighbor, to give love and to receive it, but we also have to have a strategy to fulfill it. And I would suggest to you that the strategy has to be as follows. for those Christians, you see, who think that this isn't part of their obligation, I would cite for them Genesis 12:3. And for those of you who know your Bibles, that's the Abrahamic promise. And I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great. This is to Abraham. And you shall be a blessing, and I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth will be blessed. So this vision of Abraham to go forward is a promise with a catch. And if you know from your theology, all through the Old Testament, there's a catch. The catch is if you are faithful and obedient and be a blessing to others, yes, a blessing to others, then I will bless you. And to the extent that you see the Jews, the term came from Judah and the rest, that's how the term arises, if you fail to be hospitable to the stranger, to the alien, to the others, then you see there is judgment. And so the whole Old Testament, as I see it, is this back and forth. It's this story. And the promise I would suggest to you is not simply, as the dispensationalists say in Genesis 12:3, to Israel. That promise is to us. And so to the church member who's sitting in the pew in Tennessee, North Carolina, or for that matter, Chicago or anywhere, I come from Washington State, if you're sitting in the pew and listening, the answer is yes. We must be that blessing. And if we aren't a blessing to others, then God will hold us accountable and take away the blessing. There's no inescapable truth other than that. And so the vision we have to have is to be our neighbor. And the strategy has to be to engage. I'll give you a quote, if I can find it here. I'm sort of like the professor who walks up front and carries a whole lot of papers. And the quote comes from a book. It's actually written by Padraig O'Hare, Jews, Christians, and Interreligious Relations, Spiritual Companions. And if I've got the right page, it goes like this. This engagement is really a kind of action Christology. This person, this believer, this Christian, who is centered in Jesus Christ through prayer and emulation, an action Christology. His purpose, this purpose, you see, is not simply to shore up our truth claims about who we are, but to evoke purity of heart, the mere universal religious image for the authentic self. And in this conversation, the evangelical is asked, much as others have to be asked, well, who is my neighbor, and do you love me? In a famous exchange between an Orthodox Jewish student, told by Stendhal in this story, the rabbi says, do you love me? To which the student replies, you know I love you, Rabbi. Do you know, the rabbi asks, what makes me happy, what makes me sad? No, Rabbi, replies the student. Then how, says Rabbi, can you say you love me if you don't know me? If you do not know what makes me happy, what makes me sad? So our goal in the conference here and in the days that follow, for each of us individually, is to seek to go beyond the initial stages, to move from contempt, from bigotry, from suspicion, to a kind of, yes, spiritual companionship, a real work of love, to know how our brothers and sisters of another faith feel. That is a real challenge. And to ask, what makes you sad? What makes you happy? And to be able to know. And Stendhal is saying, as is the rabbi through his comments, that unless you know that, you really don't know somebody. And so we held as part of a strategy this summer, my time is nearly up, but let me just tell you a little bit about it. Focus groups in Tennessee. And what those focus groups taught us is a number of things. Now, there's a report. I asked my colleagues here if I could distribute it. And they said, no, there will be 120, 150 people here, and you really probably don't need to do that, Richard, but maybe you can summarize it. But 2 focus groups were held in May, one in Knoxville at the New Harvest Church of God, led by Tony Ritchie, thank you, Tony, and the other at First Baptist Church in Greensboro. Is Robert here? Anyway, each group gathered for a period of approximately 4 hours to discuss Islam, national security, and Christian-Muslim relations. And the consequences of these faith group meetings were some conclusions. And among those conclusions, one of the common themes was that, yes, we agree as pastors, they were pastor leaders, that as evangelicals, we must love our neighbor, and that they wanted more interaction with Muslims. And so to learn these principles of love, forgiveness, and grace, they believed these were the entry points that would justify creating personal relationships with Muslims and their communities. So there was a lot of interest. Tony, would you agree? A very positive interest in finding common ground with Muslims. But, as per the earlier data, number 2, under the experience and views of the Muslim community, only 2 of the pastors maintained strong relationships with members of the Muslim community. All agreed this lack of interaction proved problematic in their efforts to understand the mainstream Islam. And they voiced frustration that the only portrayal of Islam in their congregations was through press where Islam was addressed in relation to terrorist attacks. That's how their congregants were understanding Islam. And so pastors believe there's a clear American conservative and progressive narrative relating to Islam, but they feel called to move beyond these pre-selected buckets. But these focus groups were especially wary, I should say this, to pronounce a religiously universalistic viewpoint that abandons conviction of Christianity or differences between Christianity and Islam. So they requested resources and messaging that would help them to be more inclusive without giving up the claim of Christian soteriological truth. Many of them are soteriological exclusivists. But they do agree, as one said, quote, we have to be able to name Jesus as Lord, but without vitriol against non-Christians. We have to hold interfaith dialogue, but without neutering Christianity. So the vision, I would suggest to you, is this. And it is happening, and it can be done. The strategy is through that kind of engagement. And so a local imam came and met with us in lunch just a few weeks ago. And a local scholar, she's here, where met with us as well. And so I happen to think that this engagement that also goes further, because I'm a public policy kind of guy, to hold, you see, by these various participants that torture isn't effective. You know, that there are public policy understandings as well that these men and women can come to when they better understand what the vision is, what a strategy for engagement is, and lastly, some good tactics. I have to say the tactic is really as follows. It comes from my work on climate. I don't deny that. I openly say this because I think there's a relationship. What has happened on this issue politically is that what were the hot-button issues of the religious right, abortion and prayer in schools and same-sex marriage, quite different today, have been replaced by other issues like climate. And I would suggest to you that the more increasing one is this one, of the Muslims, as they say, the Muslim, those who are in our country, in field training for whatever purpose this questioner put to Trump. You know, obviously someone who had animus toward those who are Muslims, but there are millions of others who listen to this and go, yes, and that's why Trump wouldn't respond. You know that. He's not going to offend the voters he thinks he needs. And so our last tactic has to be to confront. I really believe that. And so we have to move people in the pews, as I would say on climate, from disinterest to deliberation to design to doing and defending, from I want or I won't engage on this issue, to I might engage on the Muslim-Christian dialogue issue, to will, yes I will, that's design, and doing, I am doing this and then I'm going to defend it, which I will and do and have through right here today defended this kind of dialogue. That's the progression. It's a transactional thinking process, and psychologists say that sometimes it takes 7 years for people to move from I won't to I might. I got that from neurologists, Nobel laureate in fact. And so we have to both engage with people. Lastly, since my time is almost out, let me say this. What I've also learned is that in this matter of tactics, which I say requires being bold, but it also requires addressing fears. And being a diplomat, having some sense of where you begin and end and where others in your life end. It's the capacity, they say, to get outside the emotional climate of the day. It's being willing to be exposed and vulnerable. That word vulnerable again. One's imagination will be limited if you're afraid of standing out. It's not just the fear of criticism, it's the fear of standing alone. This is what all the psychological tests show. That the reason people won't change their minds is because they're afraid of standing alone. Judith Schlulitz, who is a writer for the New Republic, she says, sometimes democracy is less a matter of thinking well than choosing your friends well. And remember, she also says, decision-making and risk assessment aren't essentially rational. And so what we know from the climate debate and other issues that you see that have replaced the prayer in schools and some of the other debates that have riven our religious communities, is that scientific facts don't rule. Scientific facts don't dissuade denialists at all. And so our challenge is not to produce more facts and more information. I think Dr. Madsen will talk about this afternoon. It's not to produce that. It's to not even to produce better narratives, but to understand how those facts and narratives will translate across social barriers. And we need to present the evidence in ways that's effective and does not convey animosity, contempt, or hostility. And so diplomacy is far more effective than trying to debunk bad science or even bad theology. Diplomacy, and that's what you'll be learning today. Let me tell one last story. When I first came to Washington in 1980, I had the rare privilege of befriending two people. One was probably the greatest theologian for evangelicals in the 20th century. His name was Carl F.H., which stood for Ferdinand Howard Henry. He wrote God, Revelation, and Authority. His books were legion. And the other was his co-companion when they were both editors of Christianity Today magazine, Frank Gableline. And Frank was editing the Expositor's Bible Commentary series at the time, an incredible work, both aged men. And I had the rare privilege of being in their homes. And for a while, when Frank was ill, my wife-to-be actually cared for him. But this is the story that was told, first by Henry, and then by his son, Paul Henry, who was a congressman from Grand Rapids, Michigan, who died early in life of a brain tumor. Some of you may know, in his mere 40s, but he was heralded by David Broder and others at the time as more qualified to be president in the long run, speaking now of Paul Henry, than was Gerald Ford, who came from the same 5th Congressional District at Grand Rapids. But the story was told about King Darius. You know the story. The story I would like to rephrase in closing, just like I would like to rephrase the story of the Good Samaritan, to learn it from another perspective. It's not the perspective from Daniel, who was an advisor to Darius. When the satraps who were jealous of Daniel, whom the king, by the way, intended to put over the entire kingdom, devised a plan that anyone who makes a petition to any god or man besides you, O king, for 30 days shall be cast into the lion's den. That was, you see, the agreement that Darius signed off on. And so then when you see Daniel continued in his prayer, diplomats do that. They really do pray about these things. Darius had to make a choice. And Henry told the story. And then the younger Henry told the story. He was actually a politician, not a theologian. And he said the king really had two choices: to save his friend Daniel and sacrifice the kingdom, Because you see, if he reversed himself, he would be shown to be less than divine and off with his head. And so he had two choices. Save his friend Daniel, his advisor, and sacrifice the kingdom, or save the kingdom and sacrifice his friend. Do you follow the choice? It's what Edward John Carnell at Fuller University, Fuller Seminary, called the tragic moral choice. And our politicians and others in places in leadership and others continually face this challenge. And we do, at times, in the choices we make. The very difficult choices, the outcomes of which we don't always know. Daniel, he chose to pray and to suffer the consequences. He chose, in effect, to speak out. It wasn't simply, verbally. It was by his actions he chose to be faithful to the call. And he ended up in the lion's den, and the king had a choice, and he didn't save him. God saved him. And the end of the story, you see, is that Darius said to Daniel, "May your God whom you serve, be glorified." And Daniel, in respect to the king, said, "Oh, you king, live forever." What a diplomat. What a diplomat. And that is what we are called to be. Recognizing, you see, that what we have been given, this challenge, to be our neighbor's friends, is what God has given us. There was a time, Aaron told me to tell the story, where I had said, through the public newsletter of the association that I worked for, shortly after 9/11, the reason we have this is because we worship two different gods. And a woman wrote to me, I said, God, not the tribal God. I wasn't into Jerry Falwellism, of America, but I did believe in the universal God of the Bible, and I was suggesting that there was this difference between this God and all of them. And she wrote me a letter and she said, "That's simply the word for God in His own. What are you doing by your language?" She chided me. I changed my mind. I would simply close by uttering the words of one of the Wesleys, John, I believe. "To serve the present age my calling to fulfill, oh, may it all my powers engage to do my master's will. Arm me with jealous care, and as in thy sight to live, and oh, thy servant plead. Prepare a strict account to give." We have to say to the politicians, to those in our congregations, to our friends and others, there will be an account to give, and what He has called us to be and do is to be that neighbor, both receiving and giving. Thank you very much.